Hi, welcome to the Nonprofit Coaches webinar series, Digital Accessibility Matters for Your Nonprofit. We are excited to be welcoming Keidra Chaney here. I will be introducing her formally, but I also want to say that I've had the pleasure of working with her in the past, and I have a huge respect for her depth of knowledge, even as it's changed through the digital landscape, and you'll get to hear about her expertise now. But I've known her in the beginning as someone who had a lot of depth of knowledge around analytics around the digital space and marketing, and she's continued to just grow in depth and knowledge. So I feel really fortunate that she's been willing to share her expertise with us this morning. So here we go. I am Elizabeth Tinlayson. I am the CEO and lead coach of the Nonprofit Coach, and I have a mission to create a fairer, more equitable, and inclusive world filled with empathy and beauty. And my team and I do this by supporting our nonprofit clients with strategic planning, coaching, fundraising, training, and support. Okay, Keidra, why don't you take a moment to tell us about yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Keidra Chaney. As I mentioned, just a quick thing I'm going to do is do a quick description of myself. You'll see the picture here is of a Black woman wearing an Afro puff with large earrings. I'm smiling and I'm wearing a black and white shirt. If you see me here right now, I have curly hair. I am wearing red cat eye glasses and red lipstick, and I am wearing a gray sweatshirt, and I'm in front of a sloped white background. That was a quick introduction to best practices for accessibility for people with visual impairments, and it's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. I am not going to read this bio the way that it says, or maybe I should, just because I didn't know I was going to read it like this. But Keidra Chaney, me, is at the forefront of digital communications and digital strategy in the nonprofit sector and advocacy organizations. As a communications professional, writer, and educator, she endeavors, me, to create equitable, just, safe, and safe online environments for marginalized people. I am a 2020 fellow for the ADA 25 Advancing Leadership Institute, the only program in this country for emerging leaders with disabilities. And I am here, you can move to the next slide.
Hold on, there we go.
Yeah, so I am here to talk about why digital accessibility matters for your nonprofit. You can move back. Yeah, my background is that I've been doing digital strategy for nonprofits in the space for the past 15 years. My previous life before that, I did communications and journalism and have shifted my career several times in the past like 20 years or so. I'm also disabled myself. I have a degenerative cornea disease that has led to me having a visual impairment, or it's usually called in the community low vision. And in terms of my other credentials, I am a certified professional in accessibility core competencies with the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, which I'll talk about a little bit more. I still consider myself a digital strategist. I still do digital strategy. Accessibility is part of what I do, and part of the reason I became interested in accessibility was 5 years ago when my low vision became disruptive to me in my own career. And I wasn't entirely sure if I would be able to continue doing the work that I do. And I had to teach myself about what was available to me in terms of accessibility so that I could continue doing my career. And it became something that was a real passion for me because the accessibility that I was able to kind of advocate for and fight for myself, I wanted to be able to ensure that for other people who are in the digital space and who want and need access to information. So it's become a real passion of mine. Okay, I can move forward. So today I'm going to be covering the legal responsibilities that people have for website accessibility. I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get into too much nitty gritty, just telling you the very basics of what you would need to know. how to get started with digital accessibility, how to scale up, and what's next on the digital accessibility frontier. This is super, super high level. I am definitely not going to get into a lot of nitty gritty because we could be here for days. But I do want to like give people a real overview of what you can start doing today to start thinking about making your digital communications more accessible. Okay. So legal responsibility for website accessibility. Do you have one? You definitely do. Any business or organization that is serving the public in some way does have a legal responsibility to comply with accessibility standards and guidelines. There are, I just read this a couple of days ago, I think it's something like 90% of websites right now are not accessible. They are not necessarily compliant with the American with Disability Act guidelines for accessibility. So you have a legal responsibility, but most websites are not meeting it at this point. You can move next. So the ADA was passed in 1990, and Title III of the Americans with Disability Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in activities of public accommodations. And the law was originally written to be geared towards physical locations, and you'll hear a lot of conversation about whether buildings are ADA accessible, whether they have ramps for people with wheelchairs, whether people can access you know, being able to come up to a desk or a place to meet with somebody. But it is also applied to websites as well. You can move over. The ADA applies to private businesses that fall with one of these 12 categories. So lodging, hotels, etc. Businesses that serve food or drink, entertainment or exhibition, public gathering halls, sales or rental businesses, service establishments, public transportation, public display, recreation, education, social services, exercise or recreation. And these are very broad and very vague, and more than likely your nonprofit probably falls within one of these 12 categories. Next slide. But the bigger issue is that you do open yourself up to a legal response if you do not make your website accessible. And in the past few years in particular, there's a very big lawsuit from Domino's that happened a couple of years ago for millions of dollars. Domino's, Netflix, Target were handed lawsuits by advocacy groups about the accessibility of their website. And the National Federation for the Blind has done a lot of advocacy work around targeting or handing lawsuits to different organizations and companies that don't comply with accessibility for their websites, specifically for people with visual impairments. There was also a lawsuit in 2018 for 8 different colleges and universities that their websites were not accessible and were handed lawsuits about making their websites more accessible. So it's definitely something, if you are serving the public in some way with information, just like you would want to make sure that a building that you have has ramps for people with wheelchairs to get in, you want to make sure that the digital accessibility of the content on your website is accessible for people who might not be able to access it in different ways. Next slide. More than a legal obligation, I think I like to come at accessibility from a diversity inclusion mindset as well, because I think that the legal obligation kind of scares people, but if you are, if you're an organization that is trying to serve the public and your goal is to serve the public and as many people as possible, then understanding that disabled people are the public is super important. 61 million Americans report having a disability. That's 25% of all adults living in the US. People with disabilities are your supporters. They are your constituents. They're not necessarily people that are being served by the people that you serve. They are your audience. And understanding that, and especially there are a lot of people with disabilities who may not necessarily publicly identify as having a disability. There's a concept of having an invisible disability where it may be physical, but it may not be seen. For me with visual impairment, people don't necessarily know that I'm low vision until, for whatever reason, my access needs aren't being met at the moment. And I might need to have larger type, or I might use a screen reader on the days that I need it. And for other people who have disabilities or chronic illnesses where their access needs change and evolve over time, and for whatever they're accessing, being able to meet those access needs, regardless of whether that person identifies as being disabled or not, is really important. And it's becoming a bigger issue now as accessibility and disability justice as a concept is becoming more understood by people, that this isn't an issue of serving, you know, a small percentage of people. This is a large percentage of Americans, whether or not we identify as disabled or not. So that was my little soapbox about accessibility as a diversity and inclusion priority. Next slide. So these are the categories of disability according to the Centers for Disease Control. And I wanted to say, like, the legal and government definition of disability are these things, but that disability involves different things that may not necessarily fall into these categories specifically. So those who might be affected by mobility, so people who need a wheelchair or some other assistive device to be able to move from place to place, vision disabilities, hearing disability, cognition or AKA learning disabilities, people who are independent living or self-care. So that would include older people, people for whatever reason they may not be able to care for themselves independently, would fall into these categories. And like I mentioned before, disability and chronic illness impacts folks on a lot of levels that may not fully be defined by these 6 definitions. But when it comes to the ADA and the legal definitions of accessibility and disability, this is what it includes. Next slide. So here's the tricky part. The ADA does not have an official list or rule of compliance when it comes to website accessibility. There isn't something that you can say, if you do these things legally, you are fully accessible. What we do have is something called the Web Accessibility Initiative that's published by the World Wide Web Consortium, and they are an international organization that works on creating standards and guidelines for web accessibility. Next slide. And you'll hear a lot about this if you do move forward into doing web accessibility issues. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. I'm not entirely sure. I call it WCAG, and I'm sure somebody else may call it WCAG, but I've been calling it WCAG for these past 5 years. So I could be right or wrong. I'm not entirely sure. Either way, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is a list of recommendations. It's a very long list that has been created by developers and designers that are basically guidelines to make online content on the web accessible for people with various disabilities. And there are 4 main areas that are covered by these guidelines, and I will describe them next. So the first one is that websites should be perceivable. And the idea behind that is that people should be able to see and read your website regardless of whether they have impaired or low vision and whether they have hearing impairments. Um, Many folks use assistive devices in order to see websites. So for example, as somebody with low vision, I sometimes use a screen reader, which is a tool that allows you to it reads basically the text on a website and also descriptions of any images that are on a website and reads them aloud. Not just people with low vision use screen readers, people with cognitive disabilities often use screen readers, people who are dyslexic, people on the autism spectrum. There's a lot of different folks who use screen readers for different reasons. But a website that isn't marked up correctly for screen readers to use, it is not a perceivable website. It doesn't fall in being in compliance with part number one, website being perceivable. Number two, a website should be operable. So if you can only access the website from one type of device, then it isn't user-friendly. As I mentioned before, that people use different types of assistive devices in order to access a website. Sometimes it might be via their phone. It might be via a screen, a browser. It might be on a tablet. But if your website can only be accessed from one type of device, that you're already limiting the possibility for people who are using different types of assistive devices on browsers and mobile devices to be able to access that site. It's both an accessibility issue, but it's also an issue of uh, being able to make your website available to different types of users. So it's a UX issue as well as being a user experience issue as well as being an accessibility issue. Number three, you would want a website to be understandable. And that means basically having the information organized clearly and in a way that most customers understand. And that seems like it would be a no-brainer, but often, especially with website or with nonprofit websites, we sometimes in the nonprofit sector, like we love us a good acronym, or like there are things that we know within a particular group or a particular nonprofit sector understanding that we don't necessarily spell out to folks. And like we group content for the folks that are within our community and not necessarily for a user that's looking for information. So being able to organize content in a way that a stranger looking for your information will be able to find it clearly, not just something that folks that are within your community or within your organization would be able to understand. And the fourth one is robust. You want to have a website that can integrate with the different tools that users with disabilities rely on. So not just something like a screen reader, but these are physical tools like for deafblind people or people who may not have use of a computer keyboard. There are different ways that people can use voice to text commands and other different tools to be able to access a website without being able to use a mouse or a keyboard or the other tools, the other hardware that we tend to use to navigate the web. And you want to create a website that can easily integrate with those tools. Next slide. Actually, does anybody have any questions about that before I move forward? Oh, cool. So how do you find out if your website is compliant? The first thing that you can do is hire an accessibility focused UX consultant or designer. Just because your web developer is talented with user experience design, they may not be accessibility focused. And the place that I got my certification from, the Association of Accessibility Professionals, they have a resource where you can find different accessibility professionals across the world who do this work, but it really is important to find somebody who not just understands user experience design and development, but also understands accessibility for people with disabilities, because being able to be compliant with WCAG, if you take a look at the document for it, it's very detailed. It involves understanding a program called ARIA, which is a markup code that's used to make websites more accessible for different types of assistive devices. So you'll definitely want to have an accessibility consultant that understands that. If you just want to get started and you just want to know how good your website is in terms of being compliant with WCAG, there's a bunch of tools that you can use. One that I really like is No Coffee, which is a Chrome extension. You basically add it to your Chrome browser and you can see what your website looks like and how it is for people with a different range of visual impairments, including color blindness. I think what people sometimes don't always know is that there is a range and a spectrum with visual impairments, and it's not just like that you're completely blind and you can't see anything. And color blindness actually is a huge issue that doesn't always get covered when it comes to web design. There's a lot more colorblind people out there who may not be able to see, like if you have a Christmas themed website and the person is colorblind and can't see the difference between red and green, it's gonna make their browsing experience really frustrating. And so one of the things that happens in, with websites, if you create something where color is the only indication between important information, and you're dealing with somebody who has a visual impairment or color blindness, then like they're basically unable to see important information on the website because it's color coded in a particular way that they can't see. So No Coffee basically shows you what your website looks like for people with those different visual impairments. And it gives you the tools to be able to change that so that folks with different types of impairment can see what you're looking at. There are a few different tools that scan your website for WCAG compliance. And one that I think is pretty easy that you can just do a plug and play, just put in your URL quickly, is Cynthia Says. So it will basically scan your website and say, this is what needs to be fixed. This is a piece of code that is broken. Here's what you need to do to update your code for WCAG compliance. It doesn't necessarily tell you how to do it. That's where you would want to get a designer to come in and redesign your site or redesign your code for WCAG compliance, but at least it'll tell you where you're compliant and when you're not. And Tenon Tester does the same thing where it will analyze graphics or lines of code that need to be improved with accessibility. I think the number one thing that I've seen for most websites when you run and scan your website for WCAG compliance is using alternative text for your images. That is like the one thing that you could do today to make your website more accessible, is to do image descriptions on the pictures that you have on your website. The majority of websites out there don't have proper image tags on their photos. And you don't just do it to be clever or cute, you do it for the screen readers that I mentioned before. If a screen reader goes to a picture that doesn't have an alternative text for an image description for a picture, then the screen reader basically says that they're seeing nothing. So it would be like if you're reading something, you get to a picture and then somebody just puts a hand over your eyes and you can't see what's happening next. And especially if you don't have an image description that gives context, if it's a picture that gives context to text that you have on a website, then like the user is basically missing out on a big part of the website experience. So one of the first things, and usually the biggest thing that websites are not compliant for is creating image descriptions for pictures that are included on the website. And that's an easy fix that you don't need to be a coding expert or hire some outside person to do. So that's just a start. Any questions? Nope. Right, so thinking beyond the web, there are a whole bunch of digital resources that require accessible content, and they are not necessarily looked at. Social media is a huge one, and I already just been on my big to do about alt tagging for websites. Social media is the same thing. And you might go on social media right now, and especially Facebook, I see a lot more organizations doing image descriptions. That's something that has, especially in the past year or so, past couple of years, more websites and more organizations are doing image descriptions on social media. That's a really important one to do. And a lot of social media content isn't necessarily accessible. You won't see for video content, captions are not made available. A lot of podcasts do not have transcripts for people. So if it's audio only and there's no transcript, that basically means that anybody with a hearing impairment basically won't be able to hear your podcast on any level. YouTube putting captions on YouTube content or just video content that's on social media. One of the things that is a huge the people do on social media that don't realize is inaccessible, even though it's not really meant to exclude people, is the use of emojis. When you use, like some people like to use a ton of emojis, like dozens and dozens and dozens of them to be cute or clever. When you use an emoji, a screen reader does a short description of that emoji. So if you have smiley face and then you're doing something on social media where you have like 50 smiley faces, a screen reader is going to read smiley face 50 times. So imagine if you are on Twitter and instead of just seeing 50 smiley faces, you have to hear smiley face, smiley face, smiley face, smiley face over and over and over and over again. So while it's something that is cute and clever for people who are sighted, it can become really irritating for people who are using screen readers to have to hear something over and over and over again. Another thing that's not done that is now possible to do is until I think last year, animated GIFs you couldn't put image descriptions on animated GIFs on Twitter. You can do that now, but a lot of people still don't. So if you're posting on social media and you have somebody doing like, I don't know, you go girl, and the screen reader is not going to read the GIF. So if you are posting something with a fun GIF and you don't have a description of the GIF, somebody with a screen reader basically will just see nothing or hear nothing. So you want to have a description of the GIF as well. It does take extra time. I think one of the things that we're so used to with social media is moving quickly, posting to react to something and being as quick as possible, and making social media content more accessible slows you down a bit, because you do have to think about like describing something. How do you describe an animated GIF, especially if it's giving context clues? But it's the right thing to do. It really does open things up more for different people who are using different types of assistive devices. One of the things that I've seen on Twitter now is there is a bot called Alt Text Bot that if somebody posts something on Twitter and they don't put alt text or an image description to describe the picture, somebody will basically sick alt text bot on the person who posted, and it'll basically say, hey, this person didn't put alt text on a post that they did. It's kind of calling people out. You don't want to be on the receiving end of the alt text bots and be pointed out that your social media content isn't accessible, but I do think it is a good way to remind people that making social media content more accessible doesn't really take that much work. And it's a friendly way of just reminding people to do those image descriptions whenever they post something. Video and audio content, I talked a little bit about already in the context of social media. If you have a video, don't forget to use captions. There's a lot of different captioning tools out there. I didn't get into them because there's literally so many of them. It could be, all you have to do is look up video captioning tools and you'll find a bunch of them. And for audio content, just remembering to do transcripts. If it's audio only, that's literally no other way for somebody with a hearing impairment to access that, that content unless you have some kind of transcript. And PDFs are something that if you do like annual reports and other information that you use PDFs for, you can mark up a PDF similarly to other types of tools for screen readers. So alt text, so that people with screen readers can read a PDF in the way that they read any kind of regular Word document. And then virtual events. The description that I just did at the beginning, if you have attended a lot of virtual events in the past year or so, you might see more and more people doing a visual description of themselves at the beginning of a virtual event. And that's something that is becoming a lot more normalized because of the disability community. I think it's just a good thing to do too, because you never know for whatever reason why somebody might not have, they might be just listening only. So I think that we're outside of just accessibility. I think it's a friendly thing to do so that people can have different types of ways of engaging with your content. But virtual events too are a really big consideration for accessibility. And I think that with the age of COVID now, with a lot of events going virtual only, possibly for good, moving forward, looking at accessibility as a priority rather than something to think about later is just a really important consideration. And there's a lot of resources out there that you can look into to make your virtual events more accessible. Also, just a quick thing, understanding that accessibility is iterative. Few of us get it right the first time. There's a lot of access needs. You may not necessarily be able to meet all access needs 100% starting out, especially if you don't know what you need to make more accessible. And you might find out from a supporter or somebody that is accessing your content what you need to learn or what they need from you to make the content more accessible. So it's iterative, it takes a long time. Even some of the most accessible content and events out there, it takes 2, 3, 4 go rounds and iterations with feedback from folks with disability to make things better and more accessible. So like, it's not necessarily something where you win or lose or you do it right the first time. If you can accept that accessibility is a journey and that it's iterative and it changes and you learn more moving forward based on feedback, you're a lot more successful in doing what you need to do to make your content more accessible. Next slide. A couple other things to consider is larger font sizes. I think in general, we tend to make font too small, especially for nonprofit stuff. Like we really love putting a whole bunch of words on the slide. Even with what we did today, the first version of this, like we were just packing it full. Because you want to try to put as much information as possible and on one thing, because you feel like, well, you've got to get everybody's attention. But larger font sizes are really helpful, not just for low vision readers, but also dyslexic readers. And you want to use either sans serif or like cleaner fonts that don't necessarily have a lot of stylization on it. It just makes it easier for people with any kind of vision or cognitive issues to be able to read your stuff. And also using dyslexic friendly fonts like Dyslexie, Open Dyslexic, or Comic Sans is also super helpful. Next slide. Avoiding long walls of text is really important. Shorter sentences whenever possible. Again, for visual and cognitive issues. Also, just because if somebody is using like a screen reader or whatnot, it's just good to have. And also having resizable text options as well. Okay, next slide. Some other things to think of is using content warnings, especially if you're doing something like GIFs or videos that autoplay, or flashing images for folks that have just different issues, either people who are with autism or people who have seizures. We're not at the point anymore where we have a lot of auto-playing video and music on websites anymore, thankfully. We've kind of moved on from that. But if it is something that you have on your website, just either having content warnings, or even better, giving people the opportunity to turn that kind of information off if they are accessing your site is super important. I've said it a whole bunch, but image descriptions and alternative text for your images and animated GIFs whenever humanly possible. I feel like if you build it into the process of creating content, it becomes easier to do. So like not necessarily doing it later when the content is perfect, but making it a part of the process from the beginning, I think makes it a lot easier to remember. And including captions and transcriptions or summaries for whenever you use video or audio. That isn't always cheap, and that also takes a long time. But I think that if you start thinking about it at the beginning of your content creation process, it's not cheap, but I feel like if you're investing money, say in a video, thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars in a video or some kind of content, then you can probably afford the like extra 50 to 75 bucks of making captions and transcriptions available for that content that you create. Next slide. Emojis, yeah, use them sparingly. Don't repeat them over and over again. Don't place emojis throughout a message. Don't put a call to action after the emoji. I work in reproductive rights, and we're in the reproductive rights community online and in social media. We use emojis a lot for some reason. Like we are an emoji abuse field for some reason. And so especially with social media, like you want to make things cute, you want to make them fun, you want to try to create excitement, but just understanding that you want to try to use emojis, and also like exclamation points and other things, like those doing 200 exclamation points after something looks charming, but that's, it's hell on somebody's screen reader. So just considering that. I think one of the best things that you can do is if you have an opportunity to use it voiceover on your Mac, is a screen reader. And I highly recommend using it so that you can get the experience of what it's like to use a screen reader. on the web. And if you use it and you find it incredibly frustrating, then that is the experience that unfortunately a lot of people who use screen readers have when using the web. It's very illuminating. And it'll really help you understand like being in the shoes of somebody who's accessing different content online. Next slide. Video caption tools. Clip-O-Matic is one. If you use a lot of stuff on Instagram, Clip-O-Matic is like probably one of the more popular tools for Instagram captioning. Capwing and Amara are two more. I can personally vouch for Clip-O-Matic though. It's been very useful for the work that I've done. Transcription tools like Scribby, Temi, and Rev. Rev of the three of these is probably the most affordable, but it's also, there's auto captioning tools. And auto captions are basically, it's an AI version. It's not a human actually doing the transcription. It's done by artificial intelligence. And so you end up having some of the issues that artificial intelligence might have when transcribing something, which means that like if two different words that sound the same are being used, it might end up using the wrong word. Like, you know, I'm trying to think of one. Like, you have any examples, Elizabeth? I'm trying to think of like two words that are the same but would be used differently. Like,
yeah, I'm not sure of an example of that, but I've definitely seen in the auto captioning when if somebody said like, I'm going to do something, and it was like the M would go on to the next word, it'd be like my something, and it made a new set of words that really weren't part of it, but because the way, and also the way people change their speech between like being really fast and then being slow, sometimes that created some issues too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Rev and other auto captioning tools do that. I still think that if you have a choice between auto captioning and nothing, go for auto captioning because at least you have something there. But if you have a little bit more of a budget to pay a human to do transcription, it just makes things a lot easier for everybody, and then you won't get any comments back about misspellings, or it just saves you a little bit of a headache over time. But I do think for anybody dipping their toe into transcription, using an auto captioning tool or a free or very affordable tool like Rev, I think is great for helping people make the case for accessibility without it eating too much up of your budget. Next slide. So in terms of how to make accessibility something at your organization, I think it's really important to have a person or a group of people to really be the owner of accessibility at your organization. So one of the things that where I currently work is having, I'm basically the chosen accessibility person because I never shut up about it. So it became something that that was given to me after being kind of the advocate at my organization. But I think it's really important to make sure that there's somebody who has like accountability and can follow up with things, and really be the person to normalize and create a process for accessibility that, and also just keeps in track of the history of what has happened in accessibility at your org. It's just good to have somebody who does that. Creating an organization-wide accessibility checklist or guidelines. Some of the stuff that I just talked about, the recommendations, I think are super useful, but even just having an outside person come in and do an audit of accessibility at your organization and create a checklist of the things that you need to do in order to make your content more accessible. It doesn't have to be anything huge, but I think even having a checklist for people to look off of is a nice reminder for folks for what they need to do. And it doesn't have to be anything that's super technical, just like making sure that everything has captions or transcripts is like just a good first step. Normalize testing and auditing. Just being able to come back. It's never going to be 100% to start with. I think, making testing something that you do every 3 to 6 months. It doesn't mean that you failed. I think one of the things that like normalizing testing in any workplace makes it easier for people to take those kinds of risks and to do the kinds of things that push change in an organization. The more that you normalize testing, you normalize doing something that may not be perfect the first time around and making it better again and again and again. And I think especially with accessibility, with anything digital, like you're going to have to change it over and over again. It's going to be a process. Be open to feedback. Like I said before, having feedback for folks. Oh, I'm so sorry. Something I got like 20 calls like right now, of course. I hope it's nothing bad. Being open to feedback, making sure that you have an accessibility email account for your website. If somebody is having access needs and they need to go to your website for something and they can't access it, having an email available so that somebody can request that information is a good standard practice for accessibility. But also just like creating an accessibility statement that says, we want to make sure that we have access needs met for people with disabilities. If there is something that we could be offering that we're not currently offering with our content, shoot us a line, let us know. Keeping those channels of communication open for people with different access needs to be able to reach you and suggest those changes. You'd rather have that than have like nothing and then open yourself up to a lawsuit in the future. Like opening up that communication now keeps you from being basically handed a lawsuit later because you didn't leave it space to open up. So next slide. What's next? I think this past year has made accessibility something that more folks are talking about within organizations and becoming more of a priority. I think COVID was a real game changer for people because, and you'll even see it with different communities of disabled people, being able to work from home, being able to have digital access to different types of information really opened up this past year for a lot of people with disabilities. And a big fear is that as we go back to normal post-COVID, that a lot of these things that were made available for people as we all work from home will not be made available for people and will be forgotten. And so I'm really seeing a push in part because a lot of disabled folks are really pushing for it and advocating for it, that accessibility become a standard and become front of mind for organizations as they create content and create experiences for people. And I think that we're at the point now where we're going to see organizations make accessibility a big part of their mission. Even my title has changed to becoming an engagement and accessibility manager. And I think we're going to see a lot more organizations, large and small, build that into the work that they do, which I think is fantastic. But I also think that there's going to be a lot more tools and resources that may not necessarily be the best tools or resources out there. They're just kind of capitalizing on an interest, but may not necessarily be what folks need. So I think that having a real strong baseline knowledge of what it means to be accessible digitally is going to become more important than ever. So I really encourage folks to like go to IAAP, the International Accessibility Professional Association, and other folks to really get that baseline knowledge so that you can make informed decisions about how to make your content more accessible. Next slide. And here are some of the places you can do it. The aforementioned International Association of Accessibility Professionals is a great resource to get access to professionals who can do this work for you. The National Center for Accessible Media has a lot of great checklists and other white papers and information that can help you make your media more accessible. If you're just super nerdy and you want to look at the WCAG list of accessibility guidelines, you can do this at the Web Accessibility Initiative. If you're not a coder, you're gonna find it boring. But if you are a coder, you do know how to write code and build websites. I think it's really interesting, but it is super technical and it's super code-based. The Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup is fantastic. They meet once a week or once a month. They have great speakers. I was a speaker last year for them. They have fantastic speakers and trainings, and just like if you really want to meet the folks who are in the really in the forefront of doing accessibility in Chicago, they meet here every month. Digitally or virtually, and they used to have in-person meetups, and I'm assuming when it's safe again, they'll resume having in-person meetups. And Protest Access is an organization that they started last year in the rise of Black Lives Matter, making Black Lives Matter and other protest information accessible. So videos, news reports and other things that may not necessarily have be fully accessible to folks. It's a group of about 100 volunteers that basically take information on social media and on different websites and translate it and transcribe it and create captions for it so that folks with disabilities can keep up with what's going on in the world, especially with different protests. So these are all great places to start. There's tons more. And I'm happy to talk to you about them later if you ever want to reach out to me. Next slide.
I want to say too, for everybody, we do send out resources to everybody on the list after the webinar. So if you don't feel like you caught everything, it does come out to the email list afterwards as well.
Great. So yeah, I'd love to answer any questions.
Well, we've got a comment on here from Roy saying lots of great information. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Roy.
If people aren't going to jump in with questions, and please, if you do, I actually have several questions.
Sure.
One of my questions is, I have found myself looking at alt text and thinking, what do I say about this person? And I understand that some of these are stock photos, for instance, but I've suddenly had a realization where I've thought, maybe this person doesn't, do I call out the race? Do I not? Does this person want to be gendered or not? And suddenly I found like these other sets of questions. So I was wondering if there's so many best practices around that.
Yeah, there are, and I actually have a couple of things that I can, if you want to send out something later, there's a few different alt text like best practices or guidelines. It really depends, like you do want to mention race, like it's a thing. I know people like to talk about color blindness, but the fact is people have different races, and we have to, like, I call myself a Black woman because I am a Black woman, and like to help people get the picture, just when you are describing something, you want to make sure that you are giving people the picture that you are seeing. It gets complicated, say if somebody is like non-binary, or if you want to make sure that you're describing somebody's presentation accurately, if you have that option to ask the person, especially say if you're taking pictures with board members or supporters or whatever, like if you can reach out to somebody and just ensure how they would prefer to be described, I think that is the best way to do it. But I always go with the suggestion of describe the vision, the visual, as if you are seeing it for the first time. And what you do see, what is being presented, is what you want to describe to people. So omitting things is actually taking away the access that that person deserves to see. You're not, like, one of the things that's really annoying for folks in the disability community is when somebody transcribes a movie or a TV show and they edit out the profanity, they change the profanity. And the argument of that is like, we're not children, we're people with disabilities, we deserve to see, like, this isn't an issue of censoring for delicate eyes. You're trying to create an access experience, and so that means describing what is seen.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We've got a great question here again from Roy, who says, what's a good way to get buy-in from board members who may not realize that this is a priority? And then there's a second question, but I'll let you answer that first one.
Okay. Yeah, I do talk about this in the first 10 minutes. I think number one is you may get sued. You can talk about the lawsuits that the National Federation for the Blind has handed out to Netflix, to 10 different colleges and universities. Like, you have a legal obligation to do it. So like the buy-in isn't just about, you should do it. It's like, do you want to possibly avoid a lawsuit? Especially if you are serving the community, you could do that. But also the diversity and inclusion aspect of things is that 25% of people have disabilities in the US. Like, this isn't a small percentage of people. This is like people that you work with, people that you live with, even if they don't self-identify as having a disability, there are a lot of people who have access needs that use information. And if you are trying to reach everyone, then people with disabilities count as everyone. But if you just want to put a scare into people, just say that you could get sued. that tends to light a fire under people. For alt text, there are two different things. I think using both, because especially with Twitter in particular, their alt text feature is really inconsistent. There are times where you can put it in and like it's just buggy, and sometimes it doesn't work. So I think for Twitter in particular, putting the alt text in the comments or in the tweet after the picture is fine, just because then you guarantee that it will be seen and that like a bug on Twitter isn't going to erase it. So I would say either do both, or if you just want to guarantee that you don't have to worry about the alt text feature being buggy, putting it in the comments. But yeah, it really comes down to what makes the most sense for your folks and who's looking at your content.
So I have put Keidra's information up here on the screen. Oh, looks like we do have another chat here. Yes, so I'm going to put this up, put up my contact information as well. But I also had one last question. Sure. What about multiple languages? When people are using those readers, are they able to access it in a different language as well? Or is that something people need to be thinking about when they are putting up, say, things like alt text? And you may not know. I don't know. Just asking questions.
Well, yeah, it's not going to do translation. And so if you do have multiple languages, then you're going to have like the language translated. So for the most part, screen readers do not have like a translation aspect in it. So if you do need to have it in multiple languages, then that would be something that you would want to make sure that the content is already made available in multiple languages. But you do want to make sure for alt text that you specify what language it is in, so that if somebody has a screen reader that is set to read English and you do have information that is Spanish, you can create alt text to say that, like, the information on this website is in Spanish, the information on this website is in English. So that if somebody does have a screen reader set up, they're able to translate the information accurately, and so the pronunciation is correct.
Got it. Thank you so much, Keidra. This was just so informative. I know we've got a quiet group with us today, but I'm sure that everybody got a lot out of it. I know I'll be looking through our materials to see how we could be increasing accessibility. So thank you so much. You can see on the screen here, these are some of the services offered by the Nonprofit Coach team. So definitely get in contact if you feel that you need something, or you just even want to ask some questions. The Executive Director Support Session right now, this is a free service being offered quarterly. So they're at the same time as the webinars. Feel free to jump into that when they come up. And this is how you can reach us. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.